Hello and welcome to this CAD Image PLM webinar where we're looking at what's new in Solid Edge ST7 in assemblies. The topics for this session: we're looking at the new tools they've introduced, enhancements to some of the existing tools and tweaks to the user settings and some of the slightly more in-depth tools that will help assembly performance. There are four key areas really to the enhancements they've made at ST7 for assemblies as listed in the PowerPoint there. Let's start off by having a look at adding parts to assemblies and what they've done there. First up, we've got an insert component command. Let's pop across to Solid Edge and have a look at that. So really targeted at new users. Insert component now is a button in the command bar across the top, and if you click on it, it fires up the parts library. So a little bit more intuitive perhaps for, say, for newer users rather than have to look to the side of the screen and click on the parts library manually. Also in the user interface, they've also got Move on Select is a much larger button and easier to see. So when you select a component, you'll have the steering wheel appear on it. Ever since the steering wheel has been visible in the assembly, pretty much, they've added the ability to turn it on and off. So if you don't want to use the steering wheel or don't want to see it, then you can use Move on Select, that toggle, to turn it off, should you feel a need to. As far as building assemblies goes, we'll come on to duplicate component in a second, but as far as building assemblies goes, then the process is still pretty much the same. It's grab insert component. In fact, we can drag from the assembly structure here instead, so we'll drop out of that command, that particular part there. We'll drag it in. There's another one of these components missing. It's been capture fit, so we'll grab a few faces from the assembly and just and locate this part on that face and use some of the centers of these cylinders to line up the holes and the parts positioned. And if we take a slightly different view, sort of end or back view of the assembly, you can see there are four of these plates, or these sub-assemblies in the assembly. So that's positioning assemblies. What I've got on this side of the assembly are some fasteners and a sub-assembly for fixing this whole engine to a frame so we can do some testing. But I need a copy of all of these fasteners and the sub-assembly as well. So if we pick the bolt and the washer and then we pick up the sub-assembly as well, that'll do. So I need a copy of all those parts, actually, not just yet. Now that I've picked up those components, it would be useful to find the duplicate parts, actually duplicate components command. Where is that? Let's have a look. Duplicate. In fact, I can't be bothered to type it all in, and that's going to be enough. Duplicate component, okay, it's stuck away in the pattern group there, not a particularly large icon. Let's just change the theme here, perhaps just to give us a little bit of a better view of that tool and the icon. So there's the duplicate components command. They've added in one of these enhanced tooltips to show you how it works as well, which is quite nice. So we'll run that in a second to say what we'll do first up perhaps is just grab these components, select identical parts because I want all of those fasteners, and I'd also like that sub-assembly. Now I need a copy of all those components to go where the other three instances of that very first sub-assembly that we placed have gone, and say duplicate components going to help us with that. So because I've already got some components selected, Solid Edge skips step one. So select component step has been skipped because I've got parts selected already. If you haven't, then you just select them, and that's once you kick the tool off. Select from step, so again I've moved the prompt bar up here just to make it a little bit more visible. So click on a component to be the from component, so we'll use the plate in the sub-assembly, and then we'll go ahead and pick up some two components. So if I manually pick a two component, you can see it shows a preview of those parts in this kind of white color, but it does at least show me what's going to happen. If there are more, there's a reasonable chance that there might be sort of tens of these assemblies where I need to add in additional components. Then there is a button in the command bar that you can use to pick up any of the matching plates from our from step, and matching that'll pick up the rest of those plates in the two step. For this particular command, I can right click or accept, and all of those components will be added. And then what it does is it adds in a pattern feature into your Pathfinder, slightly different icon so you can differentiate it from a standard assembly pattern. And that is how duplicate component works. So a set of parts, a from component and a to component, and that works fine. Talking of assembly pattern, they have tweaked it slightly. We'll move on as well, and they've got a pattern along a curve which they've added too. So let's have a look at how those two have been, those enhancement and a slight change and a new tool, how they work. So pattern, rather than going into how it works, it still works exactly the same as it did in ST6 and previously, but they have added in all of the steps to the command bar up front. So in ST6 and before, they didn't have every single step on the command bar. When you started the command, it got expanded as you went through the command, which is kind of opposite of or not how the rest of the tools tend to work in Solid Edge if you're doing ordered modelling or you're doing anything in assemblies or even drawings for that matter. The other tool that they, or new tool that they have added is the pattern along a curve tool. So let's fire up another assembly that will lend itself to doing this. So we've got a spiral staircase on a boat that runs from the below decks up to the deck. Pattern along a curve, say, is the tool they've added in assembly. You can do a pattern along a curve in part anyway. So in the past, that's probably what you'd have had to have done if you wanted to create what I'm just about to do here. You've done it as all of the step components would have been a single part, which might not be ideal if you want an accurate bill of materials. So I've selected the component that I want to pattern. I want to use an edge on the model. Either of these edges to the top of this model will work nicely as this is the path for the pattern. It doesn't have to be a spiral, it could just be a straight line, to be honest. There is an anchor point that I need to identify, and typically that's a key point along that curve, and that curve's only really got it's got the start and the finish point. So I have to select one end or the other. If I didn't want that pattern to start there, I wanted it to start halfway along this curve, then we could always, or a specified distance along the curve, then we could always set an offset. That's what that offset value there does. So I could put in 0.5 meter or whatever the value is, and then it would start the pattern further along the curve rather than just starting it where the curve starts. I don't need to do that. We can move on to the next step, so it will do a fit pattern, or you can do a fixed, so I can specify the number of instances, or I can specify the distance between the instances, etc. You can change the count number and it'll update. I say 13 or 14 looks pretty good here. Maybe just a slight overlap between each of the steps is what we're after. And actually I don't really want the last instance either, so when we get to the preview stage we can go ahead and change the orientation of the pattern just to show you what you can do with that. So this, a simple pattern when you're using pattern along curve, is going to take the original instance and fix its orientation along the curve so it doesn't adapt as the curve changes, as the curve sweeps round. That's not really what we want. We want it to follow the curve, so the original definition works fine there. I don't really want the top step, so we can suppress that as an instance and get rid of it. And again, if there's another one that we need to get rid of, we can suppress whichever instances that you need to. And again, goes in as a pattern object in your Pathfinder. So that's pattern along a curve. Say a lot more useful than adding all of those steps, because if I need to change the instance count for whatever reason, my bill of materials is going to be accurate. If I had to set a manual quantity because I had created all of those in a single part file, then that has the inherent problem of changing the number of instances in a part won't necessarily update my manually set quantity. So the bill of materials on my drawing is incorrect and we end up making too many or not enough of the steps. So that's pattern along a curve. And then they've also changed slightly some of the place part behavior. So when you drag a component into an assembly, it's either the first component or it could be a subsequent component. They've tweaked slightly the way that the model might reorientate, or whether or not the part's selected or not. And again, there are some slight tweaks there if you just drag and drop, or if you're holding the shift or the control key down when you drag and drop, which can drop the component onto the assembly origin, or match the origin of the part with the origin of the assembly and lock it into place. That still works, but they've changed slightly the way that the assembly will reorientate sometimes. So that's adding parts. On the relationship side of things, they've changed the way, or added to flip and to ground as well, and also last used settings. And they've added in some changes to the way that relationships appear and how you can alter them, or some of the controls you have over them in the Pathfinder. So now that we've run through those in the PowerPoint, let's have a look at each of those as well. So if we fire up the Assemble tool, Flip was the first one in that list, and Flip really works particularly well and is most applicable to axial align and to toggle between a mate and a planar alignment. But they have now also added Flip to this command bar when you're doing some other things, so things like parallel, or if there's a tangent relationship. When you get far enough, then there will be a flip option in there. So they've added flip as an option to more relationships than it had been available to before. The ground relationship, you can now fence select or shift select multiple elements. If you need to ground loaded components, you can do it in one go rather than have to select a component, click on the ground command, select a component, click on the ground command, etc. Last use setting, that works really nicely again with things like, especially applicable I think to things like axial align. So if I always tend to lock the rotation on an axial, I may have to do that every time I create an axial align. I have to click on lock rotation. Solid Edge will remember now last use setting, so once I've locked it once, every time I create an axial line subsequently, it will be the rotation will be locked to will be set to locked anyway. And another place where that is really useful is if you use center plane. So if I'm picking two sides of a model, so I can fit it into equidistant between two sides of other faces in the assembly, then I tend to use double as the definition here. And every time I add in a center plane relationship, it's always, I typically, more often than not, are changing that to double from single, because it always defaults to single. So if you change it to double and then run center plane again, then double is the default from that point onwards, or is remembered as the setting. I'm not sure, you'll have to check to see if that is, I think it's a session setting, so every time I start up Solid Edge it might default back to single, but once I've changed it to double once, it's changed from that point onwards for that particular session. Relationships in Pathfinder is the last thing to have a look at. It'll be useful to change back to our engine assembly to show how this works. So if we pick up that first component that we added, or the first sub-assembly that we added, so we'll pick up the plate here, I think, and once I've done that, then you can see the assembly relationships. There's nothing new in that, but what is new is if I then select that assembly relationship, then you can see it's graying out the rest of the components in the assembly that relationship has no relevance to. So it's easier to isolate the view of the parts that have that relationship applied between them. And they've also, above suppress, these four tools are all new as well. So there's more that you can do with the shortcut menu. So I can zoom in to that particular assembly relationship. We can also actually just show only on those two components that that relationship is applied between. It might be more than two, but typically two. So it's a lot easier to isolate the view of assembly relationships so that you can get a better idea of what's going on, and for editability as well. So that's some nice useful tweaks for assembly relationships from the Pathfinder. On top of that then, we've got some changes to the way that Interpart Links work. Right access, it says there. What does that mean? Well, if we have a pop across to, I've opened up the help file for ST7 and ST6, and specifically the Interpart link help file. So in ST6, understanding the in-context container assembly, all this text here is quite in-depth and sometimes difficult to get your head around. The key bit really, if we just go across to ST7, you can see it's the same topic, but the text is significantly reduced. The key bit really is highlighted there. Right access to the highest level assembly is not required, and that's really important if you've got a number of engineers all working from a top level assembly and on a regular basis or not, creating associative links between parts so that you can get everything to update. Because that was a serious limitation in ST6 and before, and I've spoken to a customer in the past where that had a significant impact on what they were able to achieve with Solid Edge. So that stumbling block has been removed completely. in ST7. So it's a little bit down in the weeds, this one, a little bit more in depth, but an incredibly powerful enhancement they've made by changing the way that links work. Existing files will not get, will still contain the same link as before, so it's almost like the link is just contained in the part file and looks at the assembly, whereas in the past it would have been the assembly held the link as well, which is why you needed to write access to the assembly in order to establish the link, so you don't need that anymore. So if you do have parts with existing links, the link will still be the same as it was before. If you create new links, the link will exist in the part file and not at the assembly level. So if you want to be able to take advantage of this enhancement, then you will need to recreate those associative links in a part file. They won't get converted when you open and save the file in ST7. Peer geometry is something else that they've done some work with, and the Interpart Manager as well. So let's have a look at the Interpart Manager. If we go to the Tools tab, Interpart Manager is there. They've just added a little bit more information. It's easier to understand the nature of the link. They've put in a lot more of things like assembly relationships, so we can see that there's an assembly relationship here and there's a link between that and this component in this assembly. So that's a little bit clearer than it was before. And the other thing it says is this peer geometry, and there's a good example here for this particular assembly. If we edit down into this assembly, actually that's not the assembly that I wanted. If we have a look at all of these tubes, let's grab one of these tubes, and it's actually in this sub-assembly here, so that particular tube. And if we expand out this structure slightly, you'll notice that actually this sub-assembly contains nothing but tubes, and that's difficult to do, if not impossible to do in ST6. The references that you're using to create the tubes have to be in the assembly. I can't just create an assembly full of tubes that don't have any references outside the assembly. So how have they done that? Well, if we pop into XpresRoute to help us with this, I'm going to create, actually, we don't want to do that from the top level. I'll need to edit down into the sub-assembly to create a new tube. And then we'll go into XpresRoute. And if we run the path command, this is where we'll be able to see how this enhancement works. So if I move my mouse over the top of the geometry from the assembly level that's been isolated, or the view of which has been isolated, nothing happens. But if I hold the shift key down, this is the key bit really, hold the shift key down, zoom in a wee bit, and I can start generating or picking up geometry from the assembly level. I can set a length for that. I can do the same thing over here. So holding the shift key down gives me the ability to pick up key points from components at a different level, and then we can complete the path. Then we can go ahead and create the tube. Slight change here as well, actually. Give it a part number, but there's some save settings. So the custom XML file that the whole command uses now stores tube information as well, so that if you've got a number of different tube types that you use, you can create them once, save the settings, and then just reuse them. So if we look at some of the tubes in the background here, they're a particular diameter, they've got flared ends, all that stuff can be saved into the save settings. I haven't done that, but we'll change the diameter and just go ahead and create this tube. I don't need another one, but you can see it says created that tube and added it to the assembly of tubes. So just be careful. It's not the same as the peer geometry tool, which is still available. So if we go into the part file, if I go to tools, then peers is not on. Okay, so it's not, that hasn't changed. The function of that tool hasn't changed, but the ability to use things like XpresRoute to create or pick up geometry from components outside of the assembly that we're in is the new tool. Back to PowerPoint. So that's some of the associative link changes they've made as well. And as the last topic to have a look at here, controlling the contents of the assembly. There's a couple of tools, limited update and save update and component tracker. All those tools kind of go hand in hand. If we go back to the tools tab here, they've added in these three tools, four buttons. Some of these commands were available in ST6. Update relationships is the old update all links. So the Control U is the same shortcut. They've just renamed the command. But limited save and limited update, without going into too much detail, they're really useful and targeted at larger assemblies where assembly performance is an issue. So they reduce the amount of information that's being loaded into memory so that you have better performance in your assemblies. But the flip side of that is the assembly may not always be up to date as a consequence of loading just the top level assembly or just a certain amount of information. So if we go back to the top level assembly here, and if we turn on the component tracker again, which in itself is very much like the drawing view tracker from Draft, so that I can see that when somebody's made a change to the assembly and saved it, because the way the assembly is loaded, because I've got that limited update and limited save on, those components might not get updated straight away. But at least I have a way of seeing when a component has changed. All right, so this part here has changed. Which part was that? No, it's that one. And I can see that it's changed, but the assembly relationships have not changed by the looks of things, because if we drop out, that component doesn't look like it's in the right place anymore. So we could do update all links, or we can run the update from the component tracker tool, and then we can get those assembly relationships to update. Everything looks fine. If you need to, you can expand the entire assembly structure in that list, but generally it's more useful just to list the components or the elements that are out of date and need assembly relationships updating on them and the like. They've also made some slight changes to the way that simplified assemblies load as well. They made some good changes in ST6 fundamentally for the way that simplified assemblies work, and they've made some additional changes to the way that they load now as well, so they're even more useful than they were before. Reference occurrence has changed slightly again. It's a tool that's buried a little bit down within Solid Edge functionality, but it's if we go to occurrence properties, they've fundamentally changed the way that this higher level tool works, and that might be a useful topic. Occurrence properties in general may be a useful topic for a future webinar. Drop us a line if you're interested in finding out what they do. And then you've got rename family of assemblies member. So you couldn't do that in ST6. You'd have had to create a new family of assembly and call it what you want it, and then delete the old one, which might have had an impact on where that assembly was being used elsewhere. So now you can just rename it and links will update fine. And that is a reasonably thorough look through what Solid Edge has implemented and what Siemens have implemented in Solid Edge ST7. Actually, just before we finish off, there is one last little thing to have a look at, and it's something that I haven't covered in any previous webinars. But it's if we grab that subassembly and we'll edit into it, and we'll just isolate the view. There is one more enhancement which we haven't covered in any of the other ST7 webinars up to this point, and it's really centered around a part modeling tool. Again, this particular example shows it being used in XpresRoute, but it doesn't have to be XpresRoute. So what I've done is selected the path. I'm going to edit that path, and that path has actually been created using the key point curve tool, which is pretty much a part modeling tool. And the bit that they've changed in the key point curve tool is adding this curve length step. So what I can do now is I can actually set a length for this particular tube. So maybe all these hoses we buy in at a specific length, they're not that random. Whatever the value was before, I set it at 380. Those components, those tubes are all going to be cut to a particular length. And we can also define exactly which direction the key points move in order to action that change. So as I increase the value, the edit points along that curve, I can define exactly which direction they move in. And what we'll do actually, if I use Control U, I can do an update links, and you can see the tubes updated. And if we change the view slightly so that I can kind of fence select the bits that I need to change on these couple of synchronous parts in this assembly, if I then rotate this around, I could have done this edit earlier on, but I didn't. But you can see now that actually the whole tube is moving. That 380mm length is being maintained. If I performed this edit before I did that, then it would just be making this tube longer. There'd be no control over the length of the tube at all. So that is an additional enhancement, not covered in one of the previous webinars, but a useful tool if you're using key point curve and you need to control length of tubes, of hoses, or whatever it is. Then that set length tool is a really useful one. Had a look at some of the new tools: duplicate components, pattern on the curve, etc., enhancements, some of the changes they made to Interpart Manager, Interpart Links in general, really helping to make Solid Edge a more useful product, more user-friendly product. If you have any feedback about this session, or you have any suggestions for any future sessions, please feel free to drop us a line, and look forward to seeing you in a future session. Thank you.